Welcome to Demystifying Iran. Since 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been one of the most persistently analyzed yet intentionally misunderstood actors on the world stage. Dominant narratives from Western and oil and gas-funded Arabic and English media often portray it through the lens of crisis, irrationality, and danger. We must move beyond these media outlets and examine their major myths about the country and its allies, and to present a coherent understanding of Iran's resilience, as well as its sophisticated culture and politics. In Western discourse on Iran, we seldom hear from Iranians themselves. Iranians living inside Iran are not usually a part of the conversation. If they are included, which is more likely in some regional media outlets, they are often labeled as close to the regime, which is of course a slur that would never be used to describe almost anyone else, especially if they're affiliated with a regional family dictatorship or if they're Western. Iran's story is narrated by others, by foreign politicians, external security analysts, and a chosen group of Iranians living abroad whose worldview was shaped by what they like to call exile decades ago. Their lifestyles often depend on funding from Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Tel Aviv, or some Zionist oligarch. This disconnect between the abnormal Iran described to us and the normal Iran understood by most of its own people is the root of a persistent failure to comprehend. We need to explore this external narrative and introduce the perspectives it has intentionally excluded. This is vital because there is no accountability among the promoted experts, academics, and their think tanks. Their predictions about all things Iranian, including Iran's forever imminent collapse, have been repeated for so many years. One would assume that elites in the West would question them about their failed predictions and analyses, but they don't. For decades, many have described an Iran in perpetual crisis, often on the brink of chaos. Then, without embarrassment, sometimes in the next breath, they narrate Iran's growing threat to regional and even global stability, an unresolvable paradox that only seems to make sense when discussing Iran. Perhaps nowadays Russia can be added to the list. We're told that they failed in Ukraine, but also that they want to invade Europe. This only seems coherent to Iran's ill-informed antagonists because of the enormous reservoir of Orientalist knowledge produced over centuries, but especially after the Islamic Revolution. For the ignorant, such contradictory statements make sense because they are all similar in their dark and negative portrayals. A nation defined by conspiracy, repression, abnormality, and rage.
President Trump has called for Iran's unconditional surrender amid this growing conflict with Israel.
אין לי ספק שזה משטר שרוצה לחסל אותנו, רוצה לחסל את קיומנו. ולכן יצאנו למבצע הזה, לסלק את שני האיומים הקונקרטיים על קיומנו.
Sanctions, high inflation and high unemployment have led many of Iran's young and educated to look abroad for opportunity.
Opposition in that country has been repressed for many years.
How many people live in Iran, by the way? I don't know the population. At all? No, I don't know the population. You don't know the population of the country you seek to topple?
There's an idea from the outside, I certainly had it, that Iran, oh, it's a place of mad mullahs and nuclear bombs and that's it. And you get there and ordinary people are living pretty ordinary lives.
The dominant stories are not organic reports. They are constructs, channeled through a narrow set of aligned sources in Washington, London, Doha, Tel Aviv, Berlin, Paris, Abu Dhabi, and other capitals where the empire wields enormous influence. They are Westocentric narratives, but mimicked by their regional and NATO allies. Nevertheless, these constructs attempt to silence the complex reality of the 90 million people who have built a society within Iran's borders over the last half a century. Decades of Western, regional, and Zionist discourse have shrunk Iran's entire identity, its history, its culture, its people, into a menacing two-dimensional abstraction: a nuclear site, terrorism, and mad mullahs. This dehumanization did more than slander a nation. It created a permissive environment where international law could be suspended and sovereignty violated. The 12-day war stands as a critical case study, a direct, bloody example of how the demonization of the other actively constructs the moral vacuum necessary for aggression and criminality. When a civilization is reduced to a cartoon, its people become acceptable casualties. The ridiculous U.S. claim that the Venezuelan government is led by narco-terrorists is a similar example, a narrative built upon years of disinformation, founded on a broader Eurocentric and racist reservoir of knowledge that otherizes Venezuelans, a narrative that justifies murder and provides an aura of legitimacy to an illegal war. This despite the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration's own rejection of the notion of substantial drug trafficking from Venezuela. Our purpose should be to break this loop, to correct this asymmetry by introducing internal and authentic Iranian perspectives. We must move beyond the recycled talking points from Washington, London, Tel Aviv, and Doha. We must engage directly with the historical and political frameworks that exist in Iran. The voices of Iran's policymakers, military strategists, scholars, and ordinary citizens need to be allowed to explain their reality in their own terms. You cannot claim to analyze a nation if you're not listening to its own voices. Only by bridging the gap can a more accurate and perhaps less perilous dialogue begin. So let's look at just a few myths about Iran that are promoted by the West and their proxies. First, there is the myth of instability and collapse. For well over 4 decades, we've heard predictions of the Islamic Republic's imminent collapse. Yet the Islamic Republic of Iran has shown historical resilience. This myth is a form of persistent wishful thinking, as well as an ongoing psychological operation. After the revolution, a constitution was written and voted upon by the public. The political system was forged in the crucible of an 8-year imposed war where the Western and Eastern blocs encouraged and supported Saddam's murderous aggression against Iran. It has survived unprecedented sanctions and terror campaigns, as well as Western attempts at color revolution. It is not a fragile state, but a revolutionary and civilizational country. Its hybrid system, combining republican institutions with Islamic oversight, is designed to preserve values, to permanently keep the public engaged in the political process, and simultaneously to prevent imperial actors from deploying pressure and propaganda to derail policies in support of the oppressed, both locally and internationally. It is well suited to withstand crises imposed by the empire. It is regularly described as a regime, implying illegitimacy and instability, in regional media that are, ironically, owned and controlled by oil and gas-rich family dictatorships, as well as in Western media that is so compromised it refuses to even acknowledge an ongoing genocide in Gaza taking place in front of the eyes of the world. The collapse myth intentionally mistakes and deliberately misinterprets periodic protests, unrest, or riots for a total loss of legitimacy. It is wishful thinking that has been ongoing for almost 5 decades. The state's legitimacy actually comes from constitutional and Islamic principles, the defense of national sovereignty, and a social contract that provides welfare and embraces diversity, individual identity, and privacy. There is dissent that has its own local media platforms, platforms which, if they exist in our region, are weak and usually non-existent in almost all countries in the US camp. Yet there's also a very large and diverse base that sees the political system as the guardian of independence, dignity, and revolutionary values. High turnouts in key elections and massive national rallies, despite maximum pressure sanctions and an anti-Iran Persian media empire controlled by the West that works tirelessly to disinform and create despair, are evidence of this enduring base. Indeed, this national cohesion and unity during the 12-day war, along with Iran's massive missile and military capabilities, were what forced the US and Israeli regimes to urgently seek a ceasefire after the first week of war. One also needs to look beyond the meaningless Western binary of legitimacy. Reducing legitimacy to a simple for or against binary ignores complex realities. There are many camps in Iran, but countless polls, public demonstrations, elections, and vivid expressions of social and national unity under duress, including the 12-day US-Zionist war, show that a strong majority have always considered the Islamic Republic as the legitimate form of governance. For millions, legitimacy stems from religious belief, national identity, pride in scientific and military achievements made under duress and pressure, and a deep-seated suspicion of Western intervention rooted in modern history. The myth of universal opposition or a divided nation conveniently erases the reality of the Iranian people. It is humorous to see that in Iran, when there is fierce public debate with multiple camps, non-existent in most neighboring countries, it is depicted as an internal strife. Whereas in the West, whenever it still exists, it is depicted as a healthy component of civil society. Second, there is the myth of proxies and regional aggression. The term Iranian proxies is widely used by Western and Arab journalists and elites. This term is a caricature of reality. Members of the axis of resistance are allies, not proxies. The term proxy is deliberately demeaning and does not at all reflect the nature of the relationship. It denies these groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, Ansarullah, or the Houthis as some insist on calling them, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the Iraqi resistance, their local agency, popular roots, authentic grievances, ideals, and motivations. What is accurate is the existence of a strategic alliance, the axis of resistance. It's united by a shared ideology of supporting the oppressed, confronting occupation, and resisting Zionist and Western hegemony. The Islamic Republic of Iran provides substantial support, but they are all independent and have massive popular support among their populations. Post-October the 7th was a validation of the alliance. The events since October the 7th have not eroded, but popularized this axis. It has demonstrated a credible multi-front deterrence capability, constraining adversarial actions by the genocidal Zionist regime and its allies. It has formed an asymmetric deterrence developed over decades in response to existential threats produced by Zionism. For over 2 years, the axis of resistance proved to be the only force that fought in defense of the Palestinian people in Gaza. While regional governments such as Jordan, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and the UAE, among others, continue to import and export and preserve political ties with the Zionist regime, thus assisting Netanyahu and effectively discouraging countries from across Africa, Asia, or Latin America from severing their own political and business ties with the regime. If these were indeed proxies, they would have folded under the sheer weight of aggression carried out by Zionists, the collective West, and their regional proxies, whose territories, resources, media empires, and US-controlled military bases were used to carry out Operation Timber Sycamore in Syria, regime change in Libya, genocidal wars against Gaza and Yemen, the demonization of Hezbollah, airstrikes against Iranians, and attacks against Iraq. It is obvious the word proxy is used like the term regime to delegitimize resistance. So how does the axis of resistance align with Iran's constitutional, religious, and national values? It is a direct extension of the revolution's core principle, an anti-imperialist, post-colonial foreign policy. This is evident in Iran's support for Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua in the face of US aggression, as well as its support after the revolution for resistance in Southern Africa against white supremacism, and for the people of Bosnia during the mass slaughter. Third is the myth of the mad mullahs and the nuclear bomb. The nuclear issue dominates headlines, but is often presented in a vacuum. How is it contextualized from Tehran's viewpoint? The fact is that as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran has an inalienable right to peaceful nuclear technology, which includes the right to enrich uranium at whatever levels it deems appropriate for peaceful purposes. This is a right that a fiercely independent country like Iran is not willing to relinquish. The pursuit of enrichment is a symbol of scientific sovereignty and a direct response to a history of broken promises and animosity, from the West's attempt to prevent Iran from finishing construction of its nuclear reactors, which were being carried out by the West before the revolution, to preventing Iran from importing enriched uranium at 20% to produce nuclear isotopes for hundreds of thousands of cancer patients each year. This leads directly to the most potent myth, the idea of mad mullahs seeking a nuclear bomb. This Orientalist caricature portrays Iran's decisions as fanaticism, making it an enormous threat. It caricatures Iranian society and the political establishment, in which overwhelmingly government ministers, military commanders, MPs, and other decision makers are not even so-called mullahs. It depicts Iranian religiosity, which presumably promotes moral values, as secretly seeking a nuclear holocaust. Ironically, it is the West that is supporting the Gaza Holocaust and allows the Zionist perpetrators of the genocide to have nuclear weapons. It intentionally ignores the central governing reality of Ayatollah Khamenei's fatwa against nuclear weapons, a binding religious decree declaring such weapons to be forbidden. Just as his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, banned the production and usage of chemical weapons, even though, with full Western support, Saddam was using them against both Iranian civilians and combatants. The mad mullah narrative is a psychological tool. It replaces the complex reality, a nation asserting its legal rights, with the deeply racist specter of an existential threat from a dangerously irrational regime. It is the pretext used to justify the denial of Iran's rights and the maintenance of perpetual pressure and demonization. are several core myths that have long distorted much of the world's understanding of Iran: the myth of imminent collapse, the myth of regional aggression through proxies, and the myth of the mad mullah seeking a nuclear bomb. Instead, we see a state whose identity was fundamentally remade in 1979 around a revolutionary principle: to stand with the oppressed against the oppressor. This is not a vague slogan, but a consistent strategic doctrine. It explains why post-revolutionary Iran cut off oil to apartheid South Africa, why it severed ties with the Israeli regime and transferred its embassy to the PLO. This is the same logic that animates the axis of resistance, not a network of proxies, but a strategic alliance of independent movements united by a shared commitment to resist against occupation, ethno-supremacism, and Western hegemony. This principled stance has come at an enormous cost: an 8-year war of aggression by Saddam, instigated by foreign powers, decades of unprecedented sanctions, and a relentless Western media campaign. For too long, the story of Iran has been narrated by others, particularly Western governments, think tanks, and Zionists, as well as a small army of expatriates whose worldview aligns with those seeking regime change and who help them pay their bills. To understand Iran, we must listen to the explanations that originate from within Iran itself. Only then can we move beyond the myths that have sought to justify decades of Western pressure and violence. Only then will the real genocidal madmen be fully exposed and isolated. See you next week.